In March 1978, on the south edge of Hastings in Adams County, Earl Jordan pulled her 1971 Chevrolet C20 into the gravel lot across from the coffee shop, and the truck announced the wrong story before she even opened the door. It had 286,000 miles on the original odometer, rust blown through both rear fenders, primer spots where blue paint used to be, and a grain shovel wired to the bed because the tailgate latch had failed years earlier. Earl stepped down in patched brown coveralls, one knee hand-sewn with feed sack denim, and crossed toward the talk of spring planting while men in clean jackets compared financed combines priced at $68,000, $74,500, and $81,200. One of them, Lyle Brenner, had bought a new machine the week before with 10% down and a lender note at 7.6%. He looked at Earl's cuffs, at the cracked leather on her gloves, and asked whether she was still making do with antiques. Earl said 4 words. Paid for runs, fine. She drank coffee, listened more than she spoke, and then drove back out of town in a truck everyone read as poverty, even though she already held title to 240 acres without liens, had a rebuilt 1968 John Deere 4020 she had bought for $9,400 cash, and kept a handwritten ledger in her kitchen drawer that showed she had never signed a loan document in her life. The crux of Earl's philosophy was not romantic nostalgia about old iron. It was arithmetic, learned early and tested yearly. She was born in 1947, outside Juniata, the second of 3 daughters on rented ground that could produce good corn one year and hard lessons the next. Her father was competent, her mother relentless, and neither trusted easy money. When Earl was 12, she sat at a kitchen table while 2 men from town explained a renewal note to her father in polished language that sounded practical and ended costly. The rate adjustment moved from 5.25% to 8.0% after one poor season, then to 9.1% after hail damaged nearly a third of their yield. The payment did not care that weather had changed the math. Earl watched her father sell 27 head of cattle to catch up, then worked 2 winters hauling grain for neighbors. He kept the place, but the stress wrote itself into him. She never forgot the way interest turned one bad harvest into 3 years of penalties. At 16, she began keeping her own envelope system in a cigar box. Seed money, fuel money, machine fund, land fund. At 18, she graduated and took seasonal work at a local elevator for $2.15 an hour, then custom-hoed fields in summer, and cleaned offices at night for an additional $41 a week. She did not buy new clothes unless old ones could not be patched. She did not carry store balances. She paid cash for everything from spark plugs to sorghum seed. By the end of 1967, she had saved $4,980. In 1968, after a dry year lowered auction prices, she bought a worn Farmall M for $1,050 cash, spent $312 on bearings and belts, and hired herself out for custom raking and light tillage. That season, her gross side income reached $3,740, and she set aside $2,900 after fuel and repairs. A neighbor named Walter Hines, already in his 60s, noticed 2 traits in Earl that mattered in farming more than bravado. She showed up before sunrise, and she could leave money untouched in a jar while everyone else shopped during good years. Walter leased her 60 acres in 1969 under terms no lender would have offered, because he valued behavior over collateral. Cash rent was $38 per acre, due after harvest, and if drought cut yields below 80 bushels per acre, payment could be split across 2 dates with no fee. Earl still paid on time. She planted 58 acres to corn and 2 to feed, averaged 111 bushels, sold at $1.18, cleared $2,936 after variable costs, and moved $2,500 directly to her land fund. Walter once told her, quietly, while tightening a chain on an old disc, "Debt is rented time, and time always gets collected." Earl repeated that line for 40 years, never as a speech, only when asked. Her first land purchase came in February 1971, 80 acres just west of Pauline at $480 per acre. Total $38,400. Closing costs added $1,126. She wrote a cashier check for $39,526, leaving $2,300 in her operating envelope and no mortgage behind her. In 1973, she bought another 100 acres from a retiring couple for $610 per acre, total $61,000, plus $1,740 in transfer and filing costs, again cash. In 1977, she acquired 60 acres adjoining her original tract at $880 per acre, total $52,800, paid in full from retained earnings and a cattle sale that brought $19,460. By the time she was 31 in 1978, those 3 purchases gave her 240 paid-for acres, and nobody could accelerate a payment schedule against her because no schedule existed. Her ledger from those years read like plain handwriting and quiet velocity. 1971. Bought 80 acres, $38,400 plus $1,126 closing, cash. 1972. Net farm income, $21,870. Saved $14,200 after taxes and living costs. 1973. Bought 100 acres, $61,000 plus $1,740, cash. 1974. Drought year, yield down to 84 bushels on corn. Still ended positive by $7,980 with no interest expense. 1975. Rebuilt planter for $640 in parts versus $5,900 replacement quote. 1976. Added modest cattle line. Net income, $31,420. Saved $18,700. 1977. Bought 60 acres, $52,800 cash. 1978. Purchased rebuilt. 1968. John Deere 4000, 20 for $9,400. Reserve at year-end, $46,300. The financial contrast with peers was visible in monthly statements. A typical financed combine in that period required down payments near $8,000 and annual obligations above $11,000 when insurance and interest were included. Earl carried none of it. When prices rose, she banked the margin. When prices softened, she reduced speed, not solvency. She rented additional acres only when terms protected exit. If a lease required a multi-year commitment with penalties, she walked away. If an equipment seller pushed financing tied to variable rates, she thanked them and left. Her operating rule had no exceptions. If she could not pay cash, she waited. She lived that rule at home, too. Her farmhouse had 1 bathroom, drafty windows she recaulked herself, and a kitchen table scarred by 40 seasons of ledgers, seed invoices, and coffee rings. In 1978, her annual personal spending was $9,860, food $2,480, utilities $1,920, clothing $260, truck maintenance $1,140, property tax and insurance on the house $1,760, church and community giving $700, miscellaneous $1,600. That restraint was not self-punishment, it was strategy. Every dollar not consumed became optionality later. By the second week of October 1981, neighbors had stopped calling her stubborn and started calling her careful, though many still assumed caution meant small ambitions. They saw the rust and patches, not the compounding effect of zero interest. They saw the old truck, not the deed folder. They saw modest living, not growing control. Earl did not correct them. She greased bearings, checked grain moisture, balanced lines in a notebook, and kept building the one thing hard markets always reward: room to choose. By the time the county moved toward the end of the 1990s, those same habits were nearing their hardest test. Corn would slide toward $2, debt-heavy balance sheets across Adams County would tighten, and choices would narrow fast. Earl did not know the exact month the squeeze would arrive, but she had already built the margin that hard years demanded. The squeeze announced itself first in gossip, then in bids, then in silence at the coffee shop where men usually argued over yields. Through the winter, after that October note in Earl Jordan's ledger, seed reps began offering longer terms. Fuel invoices started arriving faster than checks cleared, and neighbors who had once talked about adding acres began asking one another about refinance windows. Earl kept the same rhythm. She rose before daylight, checked moisture charts, and wrote every number by hand, one line per decision, one decision per line. By late summer of 1999, when most growers in Adams County were measuring next season against lender conversations, she was measuring next season against cash already set aside. The misjudgment came in public, and it came dressed in polished confidence. Dealership Customer Night was held in October at a metal building north of Hastings, with bright banners hanging over a row of new combines and a catered meal served on white folding tables. Trent Halverson stood near the display floor in a pressed shirt and a clean dealer cap, greeting producers by first name and introducing 7-year packages as if he were offering weather insurance. Earl arrived in her faded brown coat with a split seam at the cuff and mud still on her boots from checking a low field before dusk. She had parked between late-model diesel pickups in her 1971 Chevrolet C20, now past 300,000 miles, tailgate still secured with wire and habit. 2 younger operators near the coffee urn watched her walk in and lowered their voices just enough to be heard. One said she was still farming like 1978. The other said she would be forced to modernize now that margins were thin. Trent waited until the room settled, then built his pitch around urgency. Corn at $2.01 per bushel, tight windows. Need for efficiency. He singled out fuel savings, lower loss at harvest, better parts support, and then he did what salesmen in hard years often do when confidence is part of the product. He turned one person into the example. He gestured lightly toward Earl, smiling as though inviting agreement, and said that discipline mattered but scale, and updated equipment mattered more. He offered a package at 8.4% interest, annual payments of $41,760 over 7 years, with a first-year service credit and deferred principal for 6 months. He asked her whether she was prepared to be uncompetitive within 2 harvests. Earl did not shift posture. She did not look embarrassed. She did not answer fast. She let the numbers sit in the room where everybody could hear them, because numbers heard publicly behave differently than numbers whispered in an office. Then she gave him the same rule she had kept since girlhood, the one line that had carried her from leased rows to deed folders. If I cannot pay cash, I wait. 8 words. No speech, no argument. The room moved on, but not really. People ate pie and discussed moisture discounts, yet they kept glancing at her jacket sleeves and at the truck outside as if appearance could settle a balance sheet. Before we go any further, if you want to see exactly how those 8 words separated survival from collapse in Adams County, stay with the arithmetic, because the next 3 seasons make the philosophy plain. What most of that room did not know was how relentlessly Earl had systematized restraint during the 1980s and 90s. She did not merely avoid loans, she built routines that made loans unnecessary. Every December, she conducted what she called a pressure test at her kitchen table. Same scarred wood, same yellow legal pad, same sharpened pencil kept in a coffee tin. She modeled next season at 3 corn prices and 2 yield scenarios. A normal year, a poor year, and a poor year followed by another poor year. If cash on hand and expected grain sales could not carry inputs, repairs, land tax, and living costs under the worst case, she cut expenses before spring rather than hoping for better markets. Hope stayed in church, she used to say. Planning stayed in ledgers. 3 days after the customer night, she opened old notebooks and updated the county-level comparison she had tracked since 1984. At 8.4% on Trent's offer, total payout on that combine would have been $292,320 over 7 years, not counting insurance riders and probable repair overlap on existing equipment during the transition. A used machine bought 2 cycles later in cash, if she waited and bought under distress pricing, was estimated at $71,000 to $96,000 based on recent auction patterns. The gap was not cosmetic, it was land money, it was seed money, it was margin. This was the underlying point that people kept missing. Debt did not only create payments, it erased choices exactly when choices were scarce. Her backstory carried one more hinge that had sharpened this mindset. In February 1983, Walter Hines died after a brief illness, and the funeral at Juniata drew farmers who rarely took a weekday morning off. Earl stood with the family after the service and handed Walter's daughter a sealed envelope containing $12,000 and a note with 6 words: "For what your father started here." The amount equaled the discount she had received over years of fair lease terms and deferred rent flexibility that Walter had extended when weather cut yields. She had no legal obligation to repay kindness. She considered it an operational one. That same spring, she wrote a new line on the inside cover of her annual ledger: "Keep freedom first. Use surplus to steady others." By the first week of November 1985, she had converted that principle into structure. She split reserves into 4 internal accounts with explicit percentages: 45% operating buffer, 30% land fund, 15% machine replacement, 10% community and emergency help. She did not formalize a foundation, and she did not publicize any of it. She simply treated generosity as a budget item rather than a mood. That mattered later when hard years arrived and panic tempted people into narrow thinking. Her year-by-year entries through that period read like careful machinery, not drama. 1982, net farm income, $74,630. Saved $48,200, no interest expense. 1983, corn weak, repairs high. Net $52,410. Saved $26,900. 1984, Bought used 1976 grain dryer for $6,700 cash. Comparable new, quote, $24,800. 1985. Added 70 leased acres with 1-year walkaway clause, $62 per acre cash rent. 1986. County stress rising. Maintained reserve at $211,000 while peers refinanced. 1987. Purchased 40 acres from estate sale, $46,400 cash, plus $980 fees. 1988. Drought. Yield fell to 79 bushels on dry land acres. Ended year positive by $11,370 because fixed debt service was zero. 1989. Rebuilt combine feeder house with $1,860, parts and labor swap. Replacement, quote, $13,500. 1990. Net farm income $88,940. Saved $57,300. 1991. Bought 30 contiguous acres, $39,000 cash. 1992. Sold old cattle, shed lumber and scrap, $4,260, added to machine fund. 1993. Flood year pressure, used reserves for inputs, no borrowing. 1994. Reserve reached $302,000 after 2 strong harvests. 1995. Declined dealer package at 9.1%. Kept existing equipment and spent $3,420 on preventive overhaul. 1996. Bought 80 acres at $735,000 total with the savings and cattle sale proceeds. 1997. Net farm income, $92,400. Saved $61,100. 1998. Cash reserve reached $418,000. Those lines look dry until you place them beside what standard leverage required in the same years. On a typical machinery stack, a producer could carry annual principal and interest obligations above $70,000 before seed touch soil. Add rent, fertilizer, and fuel, and a mediocre market turned decent operators into distressed borrowers with little room to negotiate. Earl's model reversed that pressure. She carried more maintenance hours and drove older equipment, but she held liquidity. Liquidity meant timing. Timing meant power. Her early discipline was visible in small moments that never made county headlines. In March 2000, when a corn head on her older combine showed severe wear, a dealer estimate for replacement ran $18,600 before tax. Earl removed the unit, spread parts on a tarp, and sourced bearings, chains, knives, and gathering components for $1,140 total from 3 suppliers and 1 salvage yard near Grand Island. She and a hired hand spent 2 evenings rebuilding it. Total cash outlay, including labor meals and diesel for pickup runs, $1,286. Functional result: 1 more season of dependable harvest, then another. Savings versus replacement, quote, $17,314. She wrote that figure in the margin and underlined it twice. By early April 2000, while others signed multi-year rent agreements to secure acreage at almost any terms, Earl only rented ground with exit clauses and no debt-backed obligations. She added 380 acres to bring total planted acres near 620, but every lease carried a 1-year reset option tied to commodity pricing and input inflation. If corn dropped below her threshold model, she could release acres without penalties that would spill into the next year. Most people interpreted that as timid. It was not timid. It was engineered flexibility. Her home life never drifted from the same pattern. In 2000, her personal spending was $17,430, itemized and defended like any farm input. Food $4,860, utilities $3,420, clothing $410, truck fuel and maintenance $1,980, home insurance and property tax $3,140, church and local giving $1,200, medical and miscellaneous $2,420. She still patched work clothes. She still repaired windows instead of replacing them unless repair failed twice. She still drove to town with a list and came back with what was on the list. Nothing more. Nothing financed. There was irony in how visible her restraint was and how invisible her position remained. At the same time, she was being read as undercapitalized because of her truck and coat. She was evaluating auction parcels from a place of strengths. Distress listings began to rise as corn hovered between $1.98 and $2.24, and she attended sales with a folded sheet in her pocket showing bid ceilings based on projected cash flow under low-price assumptions, not optimistic projections. She bought nothing above her line. When parcels missed by $2,000, she walked away without complaint. Then came the auction that shifted county perception from rumor to fact. A 120-acre distress parcel opened at a figure nobody expected to hold. Bidding climbed, then hesitated. Earl stepped in at $246,000 and did not blink when the auctioneer looked for financing confirmation. She handed over proof of funds, closed in cash, and left in the same rusted Chevrolet that had invited so many wrong conclusions. Trent Halverson was standing near the clerk table. He watched her sign without a lender present, and for the first time he stopped framing her as a holdout from another era and started recognizing what she actually was. A farmer with optionality in a county where optionality was vanishing. That was the hinge, not triumph, not spectacle. Just arithmetic reaching daylight. And as winter moved toward the spring of 2001, with notices mounting and conversations turning tight, Earl kept writing the same line on new pages. Cash first, debt never. Decisions made before panic. By the third week of January 2001, Earl sat at the same kitchen table and converted that rule into numbers for the season in front of her. She started with acres, not hope, 240 acres owned free and clear from earlier years, plus paid-for tracts she had added over 2 decades, plus 380 rented acres under 1-year clauses for 620 planted acres she could either carry or release without penalty. Then she priced every input twice, once at supplier quote and once at cash prepay quote. Seed came to $38.50 per acre, or $23,870 total. Fertilizer penciled at $74.20 per acre, $46,004 total. Chemicals were $31.60 per acre, $19,592 total. Fuel, drying, repairs, crop insurance, labor, and rent brought projected outlay to $194,860 before harvest. Interest expense, $0. Debt service, $0. Those 2 zeros were the quiet center of the page. She did not run one revenue forecast. She ran 3. At 150 bushels per acre and $2.10 corn, gross on 620 acres would be $195,300 before basis adjustments and government support programs. At 132 bushels and $1.98, gross dropped to $162,043. At 110 bushels and $1.94, the number tightened hard at $132,308. Most farmers in the county could not even look at that third scenario because one bad sheet could force a banker meeting. Earl looked at it first. Her reserve entering 2001, after the 2000 auction purchase and winter input payments, stood at $503,000 in cash and near-cash grain inventory. That reserve was not vanity. It was shock absorption. The prior 2 seasons sat in her ledger as context, not as a chapter she needed to relive. In 1999, with corn near $2.01 and local cash bids below that, after basis, she covered spring inputs from reserves and refused short-term operating debt, even when offered at promotional terms. In 2000, she bought a used 1983 grain truck for $4,800 cash, then rebuilt the worn corn head for $1,286 total outlay, parts, supplies, and outside machine work, instead of replacing it for more than $18,000. She purchased the 120-acre distress parcel for $246,000 cash, paid closing fees from operating surplus, and still protected working capital. Now she was planning 2001 from that same position, debt-free, liquid, and able to adjust fast. What made this progression so powerful was not only what she bought, it was what she refused to lock herself into. She did not sign multi-year equipment notes. She did not take variable rate machinery financing, linked to dealer promotions that looked manageable at harvest highs and punishing at harvest lows. She did not roll old debt into new packages to lower monthly payments while extending total interest exposure. She bought slower, but she kept ownership clean. A single season in her ledger from that period read like a case study in optionality. In February, she prepaid part of fertilizer for a 6.4% discount, reducing cash costs by $2,944. In March, she bought replacement hydraulic lines and bearings in bulk from an independent supplier, cutting repair expense by another $1,120 against dealer list pricing. In June, when one rented tract showed poor stand counts and thin topsoil moisture, she reduced nitrogen side dress rates there, saving $3,180 with minimal yield penalty based on tissue tests. In August, she forward-priced only 1/3 of expected production, leaving room if basis improved post-harvest. In November, she delivered stored grain into a stronger basis window and picked up 17 cents per bushel on 28,000 bushels, an extra $4,760. None of those choices looked cinematic. Together, they were the difference between strain and control. By late spring 2001, she ran a deeper 10-year comparison for herself, not to impress anyone else. If she had accepted one typical dealership growth path in the mid-1990s, she estimated cumulative principal and interest outflow by 2001 would have reached $486,000 across combine, planter, and support equipment upgrades. Her actual cash spending on used purchases, rebuilds, salvage parts, and labor trades over the same window totaled $171,340. The spread was $314,660. She could point to exactly where that spread went: land, reserves, and freedom. She had watched that equation play out enough times to stop treating it as theory. 2 farmers could face the same weather and the same market, but the one owing a payment every month had far less room to maneuver when conditions turned. The contrast in Adams County was not a morality tale about wise people and foolish people. It was a structural lesson about timing and leverage, and the casualties were good farmers who were caught by compounding obligations when prices stayed low longer than anyone planned. Daniel Cruz had expanded aggressively in the years when lenders rewarded scale. He was competent, up before dawn, and well regarded for machine maintenance. By 1998, he was operating on 640 leased acres with newer financed equipment carrying $1.3 million in total debt. His blended rate started near 6.9%, and on paper his numbers worked under normal yields and $2.40 corn. When rates reset upward under risk provisions and effective costs moved to 10.8%, annual interest alone jumped from roughly $89,700 to about $140,400. Add principal obligations, rent, and input costs, and his yearly cash requirement outran his margin. He did not fail because he was careless. He failed because narrow margins and rising finance costs reached him in the same seasons. He eventually lost the 640-acre lease package and had to liquidate equipment under pressure pricing. Maria Tellez had built a mixed operation with discipline and stamina, carrying both crop acres and a herd she had expanded carefully over years of long days and little sleep. Her operating line reached $380,000 as feed costs climbed and crop revenue softened. She entered renewal meetings with records in order, conservative projections, and a workable recovery plan. But the bank tightened credit standards across the portfolio and denied renewal without additional collateral she did not have. Interest and carry costs consumed breathing room. She sold the herd to stop the bleed and preserve what land control she could. The sale was orderly, not chaotic, but it was still a loss measured in years of work. Nolan and Pete Whitaker were brothers, practical and respected, running 520 acres with machinery notes and land obligations that had looked manageable during stronger commodity cycles. Then 2 dry years cut yields, while debt service held steady at $27,000 per month, $324,000 per year before many variable costs. They negotiated, restructured, sold pieces, and kept trying. It was not enough. Foreclosure hit the 520-acre block, and the brothers split operations afterward into smaller rented footprints they could carry with a lower overhead. They were not reckless men. They were men whose fixed obligations did not bend when weather and markets did. Even Lyle Brenner, who had teased Earl in 1978 about antiques, did not escape pressure. His financed machinery stack from multiple upgrades in the 1990s forced annual payments above $96,000. He covered for a while by adding custom work, then sold one newer unit, and went back to an older combine to cut obligations. He survived, but he told friends later that he spent 3 years farming for the bank first and his family second. By the first week of August 2001, those separate stories had merged into a county mood that felt heavier than any one statistic. Auction flyers multiplied on bulletin boards. Lawyers who handled restructures were booking farther out. Seed reps started checking account status before discussing hybrids. In courthouse records, lien filings rose. In church parking lots, conversation shortened. The external shocks were not subtle. Cash corn in parts of central Nebraska moved inside a band that offered little cushion, with local basis often turning a board price near $2 into a check well below what heavily financed operations needed. At the same time, fertilizer prices climbed, fuel stayed volatile, and lenders added risk premiums or stricter terms even when headline rates elsewhere looked lower. In plain language, money got more selective exactly when farmers needed flexibility. It was a non-trivial compression. Weaker output prices, sticky or rising input costs, and tighter credit standards landing together. Earl's survival during that compression did not come from bumper yields or luck with the weather windows. It came from a balance sheet designed for ugly years. She carried no machinery note, no land mortgage, and no operating line that could be reduced mid-season by a loan committee. When margins narrowed, she adjusted acres and timing, instead of begging for extensions. She released 70 rented acres that no longer met her threshold, and kept the ground that still penciled out under conservative assumptions. She paid suppliers early where discount math was clear. She delayed non-essential purchases. She kept labor lean and maintenance discipline. She did not need heroic prices to remain solvent. One line in her 2001 workbook captured the full trade-off between appearances and reality. Under a low-price scenario, her operation showed a projected operating loss of $21,400 before reserve usage. A neighboring leveraged model at similar scale, with annual debt service above $240,000, showed a projected deficit exceeding $180,000 before any major repair surprises. Earl could absorb a $21,400 hit and continue. The leveraged model needed immediate restructuring or asset sales. This dynamic was the whole argument, stripped of personality. Debt had converted ordinary volatility into existential risk. 3 days passed before she heard from Daniel after he surrendered the lease package, and when he came by the farmhouse, he did not ask for a speech. He asked for numbers. Earl gave him copies of her cash flow templates, worst-case yield tables, and a one-page worksheet titled, "What Can Be Dropped Fast?" She gave the same materials to Maria, then to Nolan and Pete. Each conversation private, each one practical. She did not offer grand theories. She offered arithmetic and a chair at the kitchen table. By late February 2002, with corn briefly printing at $1.94 and more notices arriving across the county, Earl understood that private survival was no longer enough. Her reserves had done what they were built to do. The question now was whether those reserves could stabilize other farms before another season of forced selling erased more families from the map. She closed the ledger for the night, marked 3 names on a fresh page, and started calculating what zero-interest help would require to work without trapping anyone in a new kind of dependency. She began with the names she had written at the bottom of the page and then added one more line above them. Terms must protect dignity as much as cash. By the second week of March 2002, a foreclosure auction on 160 contiguous acres east of Hastings gave the county its first clear look at what Earl Jordan had actually built. Trent Halverson arrived early in a clean pickup with dealership plates and stood near the clerk table, speaking in low tones with operators who were trying to decide whether they could stretch one more season. Earl arrived in the same 1971 Chevrolet C20, rust showing through both rear fenders, grain shovel still wired in place, coveralls faded at the seams. The visual script looked familiar. Then the bidding started. Opening bid came at $420,000. 2 investors pushed it to $510,000. A local partnership moved to $560,000, paused and looked toward their lender representative. Earl stepped in at $585,000. The partnership answered at $600,000. Earl said $612,000, flat and calm, and did not lift her hand again. When the hammer fell, the clerk asked for financing documents. Standard procedure at that size. Earl slid over a certified check for $612,000 and a current proof of funds letter for closing reserves. The letter listed liquid balances in 2 institutions totaling $1,948,300 $327 after the check cleared, plus grain inventory valued at $286,440 at conservative local bid. No liens, no pledged collateral. The room did not erupt. It went quiet. One of the investors folded his bidder card and stared at the paper for a long second. Trent read the balance line twice, then once more, and the confidence he usually wore, like pressed cotton, shifted into something closer to recognition. He had sold urgency for years by telling farmers they needed financing to stay competitive. Here stood a woman in patch coveralls and a truck most people would not trade for a set of tires, holding more cash flexibility than nearly anyone in the building. At closing, final costs added $18,740 in fees, filings, and prorated taxes. Earl paid them the same day. Total outlay was $630,740. She drove home without changing anything visible about her life. That detail mattered. People had expected that if she had money, she would signal it. New pickup, new coat, some outward marker. Instead, she bought another thermos, patched a pocket, and opened a fresh ledger page. If you want to know whether wealth is real or performative, watch what a person does in the week after a win. Earl spent hers drafting agreements for other people. She did not create a charity, and she did not call a press conference. She built a private recovery pool from her own reserves and named it nothing. On March 19th, she set aside $900,000 in a segregated account under attorney review with one operating rule written into every note: 0% interest, 5-year term, crop share contingency, and one non-negotiable condition that each recipient mentor one younger producer for 2 full seasons. Help could not stop at rescue. It had to propagate. Maria Tellez came first. They sat at Earl's scarred kitchen table with coffee and 3 sharpened pencils. Maria requested enough to re-establish herd capacity and secure planting without renewing high-cost credit. Earl structured $250,000 in tranches tied to specific uses and receipts. $112,000 for livestock restock at auction caps, $78,000 for seed, fertilizer, and chemical input, $34,000 for fence and waterline repairs, $26,000 as working cushion for payroll and veterinary cycles. Repayment formula was 7% of annual gross in years when net margin exceeded 10%, 3% in thin years, 0 required in documented loss years. No compounding, no penalties. Maria signed with steady hands, then cried once, quietly, and said she would take 2 beginning operators if she could find them. Daniel Cruz came 2 days later with folders of equipment statements and lease termination letters. His need was different. Stabilize machinery access and stop liquidation bleed. Earl allocated $180,000. $96,000 went directly to a negotiated leased equipment buyout at discount, converting volatile monthly obligations into owned utility at a lower capital base. $52,000 covered seed and fertilizer. $18,000 secured crop insurance and fuel. $14,000 funded emergency repairs and tire replacement before planting. His repayment schedule mirrored Maria's, but included an additional clause. In any year he posted net above $90,000, he would prepay 12% of original principal to recycle capital faster into the pool. Daniel read the pages twice and asked one question. No interest, even if I am late? Earl answered in 6 words. Late is weather, not character sometimes. Nolan and Pete Whitaker came together and left separately by design. Earl insisted on separate notes to protect each brother's restart from the other's future risk, Not because of distrust, but because shared liability had hurt them once already. She split $140,000 into two $70,000 agreements. Nolan used $41,000 for rent on 210 acres with one-year exit clauses and $29,000 for inputs and repairs. Pete used $38,000 for rent on 190 acres, $22,000 for a paid-for used planter, and $10,000 in operating buffer. Both notes carried the same 5-year zero-interest framework and the same mentorship condition. That left $330,000 in the pool. Earl deployed it not as idle reserve, but as coordinated purchasing power for participating farms. She prepaid fertilizer, seed, and diesel in bulk windows where cash discounts were highest, then allocated inputs at verified cost across Maria's, Daniel's, Nolan's, Pete's, and Earl's own acres. The arithmetic was exact. Combined fertilizer need totaled 1,146 tons. Posted in season, blended cost averaged $312 per ton. Cash prepay negotiated cost averaged $289.52. Savings per ton, $22.48. Total fertilizer savings, $25,756.08. Seed discounts averaged 6.1% on $418,000 of combined orders, saving $25,498. Diesel contracts saved 11.4 cents per gallon across 184,000 projected gallons, saving $20,976. Chemical bundles saved another $14,312. Net purchasing advantage reached $86,542.08 against in-season pricing, lowering effective input cost by 7.2% across the participating operations. This was the hidden engine of her model. Not only no interest, better cash terms. Let me stop here and ask you something. When pressure rises, do you optimize for appearance or for options? Adams County had spent years rewarding appearance. Spring 2002 started rewarding options again. The county meeting that summer was held in a school gym with metal chairs and poor acoustics, and nobody expected a confession from the dealership side of the room. Trent stood during the equipment risk discussion and spoke without sales cadence for the first time many people had heard. He said the leveraged expansion packages he had promoted through the late 1990s had underperformed in prolonged low-price conditions. He said Earl's zero-debt structure had preserved decision control while finance models lost it. Then he announced his dealership would expand used inventory, shorten financing horizons where loans were unavoidable, and require downside cash flow scenarios in every recommendation. There was no drama in his tone, just a public correction. Earl did not answer with a speech. She said, "Use that is paid for can sleep." Then she sat down. The deeper proof came in the ledgers over the next 5 seasons, where philosophy had to survive weather, basis, and human fatigue. Earl kept a parallel page for each recipient and one aggregate sheet for pool performance. 2002, recovery pool funded at $900,000. Disbursed $570,000 direct notes. Input prepay facility allocated $330,000. Combined participant acreage 1,840. Weighted average corn yield 126 bushels. Average cash corn price $2.03. All 4 recipients remained solvent through harvest. Required repayments triggered only for Daniel and Earl under margin thresholds. Pool year-end balance after repayments and reallocation, $742,118. 2003, Spring moisture improved. Combined acreage 1,910. Yield average 141 bushels. Cash corn averaged $2.32. Maria made first scheduled payment of $18,400. Daniel paid $22,600. Nolan paid $8,200. Pete paid $7,900. Input discounts repeated at 6.8% due to lower fertilizer spread. Pool year-end balance 800 to 1,500 Z's, $44. 2004. Price softness returned, plus hail pockets in June. Yield average 119 bushels. Cash corn average $2.06. Repayment clauses reduced automatically. Maria paid $7,500. Daniel paid $10,200. Nolan and Pete received loss year deferrals with no penalties. Two mentored young producers, Caleb Dunn and Iris Molina, each completed first full season under recipient guidance. Pool year-end balance, $768,930, 2005, better basis and cleaner weather. Yield average 153 bushels. Cash corn averaged $2.18 plus storage gains for deferred sales. Maria paid $26,300. Daniel paid $31,900, including high-margin prepay clause. Nolan paid $14,100. Pete paid $12,700. Both Whitaker operations cleared positive retained earnings for the first time since foreclosure. Pool year-end balance, $861,772. 2006. Combined acres rose to 2,040 as recipients expanded cautiously on cash rent with exit terms. Yield averaged 147 bushels. Cash corn averaged $2.41. Total repayments across 4 notes reached $118,500. Earl recycled $90,000 into 2 smaller zero-interest operating bridges for mentored entrants, both capped at $45,000 and tied to equipment sharing rather than new purchases. Pool year-end balance, $934,880. 2007. Original notes remain current under contingency terms. Aggregate principal repaid across Maria, Daniel, Nolan, and Pete reached $402,300 cumulative. 0 defaults, 0 interest charged. Combined participant and mentee acreage crossed 2,260. Total estimated family-level net worth across original recipients, still conservative, rose from near-distress levels in 2002 to $4,870,000 in land equity, equipment equity, and cash by end of year. The multiplier was no longer theoretical. One farmer's liquidity had prevented 4 forced exits, supported at least 2 new entrants, and preserved productive acres that would likely have been consolidated under distressed pricing. If you are learning something from this, pass it to one producer who still thinks the main goal is to look large instead of stay durable. Earl's own books over the same window stayed disciplined rather than flashy. She continued to cap personal living costs, continued buying used equipment in cash windows, and continued declining long-term notes even when commodity prices improved. The rusted truck eventually gave way to a different old truck, not because image changed, but because transmission failure finally won. Her operating thesis never did. Cash first, debt never. Help with terms that keep people upright. By Harvest Close in 2007, Trent's dealership lot held more trade-ins from right-sized operators and fewer high-risk packages than at any point in the prior decade. Maria had rebuilt herd flow and crop stability, without reopening costly credit lines. Daniel had moved from triage to mentoring. Nolan and Pete ran leaner separate operations with independent books and no shared debt. Earl kept writing in the same hand, one line per decision, watching arithmetic do what argument rarely can: settle a county-wide debate without raising its voice. In December 2007, while most year-end meetings in Adams County were still framed around debt restructuring, Earl framed hers around completion rates, mentorship hours, and how quickly the recovery pool could revolve without hardening into another institution that forgot the people it was built to serve. She met each recipient alone first, then together, then with the younger producers they had mentored under the condition written into every note. The structure held because it remained practical. Maria brought calving records, crop margins, and 2 scholarship draft letters. Daniel brought machinery depreciation sheets and a new template for beginning operators who were one bad input decision from needing credit they could not sustain. Nolan and Pete brought separate balance sheets and, for the first time since foreclosure, separate 5-year plans that did not assume heroic prices. By the second week of February 2008, the first full cycle of outcomes was clear enough to measure beyond survival. Maria Tellez had stabilized her mixed operation at 410 acres, with herd numbers right-sized to feed capacity rather than optimism. Her gross farm revenue that year reached $612,400. Operating costs were $498,300, and her retained earnings after tax and note payment were $71,600. She did not use those gains for expansion debt. She created 2 agricultural scholarships at $7,500 each per year for students from farm families in Adams and Clay counties. Funded from a segregated account, she replenished every harvest. Between 2008 and 2012, those scholarships distributed $75,000 total to 10 students, and 7 of them returned to agricultural work in Nebraska within 3 years of graduation. Maria called that her most important yield number. Daniel Cruz rebuilt more slowly than he had grown in the leveraged years, and that was precisely why it lasted. He moved from emergency stabilization to durable operations by owning fewer machines outright, sharing specialty equipment during narrow windows, and refusing notes that required rosy scenarios to pencil out. His acres climbed back to 520 by 2011 through short-duration rent terms and one carefully timed cash purchase of 60 acres at $2,150 per acre, total $129,000, funded by retained earnings and grain sales. He maintained 0 machinery loans, carried no revolving operating line after 2010, and posted a debt service ratio that remained structurally low because debt service itself was near 0. He also fulfilled the mentorship condition well past the required term, guiding 4 beginning operators through budget design, prepay math, and lease exit clauses. 2 of those operators, Caleb Dunn and Iris Molina, eventually partnered on custom planting and harvest support, both using paid-for used equipment and no long-term notes. Nolan Whitaker and Pete Whitaker never rejoined operations, and that separation became their strength. Nolan held at 260 acres by 2012, with annual gross revenue around $401,000 and living costs under $52,000. Pete managed 240 acres with similar restraint and built a machinery replacement envelope that reached $96,400 by the end of 2012. Both brothers paid off their 0-interest notes on schedule. Nolan completed his final payment in September 2009, Pete in November 2010. Neither returned to shared liability, and both kept one line from Earl pinned above their ledgers: Separate books prevent shared collapse. The multiplier effect by then was not rhetorical. Original direct support from Earl totaled $570,000 in recipient notes, plus coordinated prepay purchasing that reduced input costs. By the end of 2012, those same recipient operations and their direct mentees collectively controlled 3,140 acres with no high-risk machinery debt, held combined estimated net worth of $16,108,000 at conservative land and equipment valuations, and had produced cumulative local payroll and contractor spending above $4,300,000 across a decade. One disciplined reserve had turned into a county-level stabilizer. Quietly, line by line. By late harvest 2009, even the language in coffee shop conversations had shifted. Men who once asked who had the newest combine started asking who had the lowest break-even. Women balancing family books asked for cash flow templates, not sales brochures. Younger operators began to treat exit clauses as basic protection instead of timid hedging. Earl never claimed authorship of that shift. She simply kept sharing worksheets when asked. Trent Halverson's resolution took longer because public correction is easier than private reinvention, and he had spent years building a career on exactly the model he later questioned. In 2008 and 2009, he pushed his dealership to expand used inventory from 18% of lot value to 43%. Added side-by-side downside scenario sheets to every financing discussion, and trained younger sales staff to present total payout and interest burden before monthly payment language. Some clients thanked him. Some left for competitors still selling scale with softer words. Trent accepted both outcomes. His commissions dropped for 2 years, then stabilized at lower volume and lower risk exposure. By the first week of March 2012, he visited Earl at her farm office, hat in both hands, and asked if she would review a pamphlet the dealership planned to distribute to beginning producers. It explained variable rate risk, payment stacking, and why maintenance records on older equipment often mattered more than paint. Earl read it in silence, circled one sentence, and wrote in the margin, "Show 7-year total with and without interest." Trent nodded and rewrote the table before printing. That small edit became the page most people remembered. He retired in 2018, not as a villain defeated, but as a salesman who had seen the arithmetic turn against his old assumptions and chosen to change while he still could. At his retirement dinner in Hastings, attended by growers who had argued with him for decades, he told a room of 140 people, "Interest can erase 10 years of hard work in 3 bad seasons. I sold plans that forgot that. I do not forget it now." He and his wife moved to Grand Island, where he later volunteered with a farm transition program helping families compare financing structures without sales pressure. His reputation ended steadier than it began. Earl's own ledger from 2008 through 2012 looked almost plain, which was the point. 2008. Total owned acres 1,000, no debt. Net operating surplus $284,600. 2009. Bought 90 acres adjoining East Block at $3,400 per acre. $306,000 cash, plus $7,920 closing. 2010. Liquid reserves crossed $1,760,000 after grain sales and note repayments to pool. 2011. Bought 90 acres near Pauline at $4,250 per acre, $382,500 cash, plus $9,440 fees. 2012. Total owned acres, 1,180 debt-free. Conservative land valuation, $5,900,000. Liquid reserves and grain inventory, $2,100,000. The appearance remained unchanged enough to keep fooling people outside the county. Her 1971 Chevrolet finally retired when transmission and frame fatigue made further repair inefficient. She replaced it with a 1989 Ford F-25. Bought, used, and paid in full, 312,000 miles, cracked bench seat, faded red paint, heater that worked only on high. She drove it to seed pickup, church, auctions, and the scholarship ceremony, where Maria's first two recipients thanked donors in borrowed jackets. Earl wore the same patched coat with new stitching at the cuff. By the second week of October 2012, Adams County had a full roll call of people once used as cautionary tales, now measured in durable outcomes. Maria Tellez still operated 410 acres and still funded the 2 annual scholarships at $7,500 each every year, even in lower margin seasons. Daniel Cruz still farmed 520 acres with no machinery loans and had become the person beginning operators called before signing anything longer than one page. Nolan Whitaker and Pete Whitaker still ran separate, debt-free operations, each modest, each solvent, each with stress-tested budgets that assume bad years would come again because they always do. Lyle Brenner, who had once asked Earl whether she was making do with antiques, had spent the 2000s unwinding his own machinery stack after years of heavy payments. He never lost his home place, but he sold 2 newer units, downsized custom work, and rebuilt around paid-for equipment by 2013. He later told a younger neighbor without embarrassment that pride in the wrong decade had cost him more than drought ever did. By 2018, he was semi-retired, helping his daughter and son-in-law on weekends and keeping records tighter than he had in his 40s. Walter Hines remained present in the county by memory and by consequence. His daughter kept the envelope Earl had given her at his funeral, and later used those funds, plus her own savings, to repair the family barn and lease ground to a beginning couple under terms that mirrored Walter's old fairness. Pay after harvest. No fee in true disaster years. Character first. The line kept traveling. Caleb Dunn and Iris Molina, the 2 early mentees tracked from 2004 onward, formed a small operating partnership in 2011 focused on custom planting, grain hauling, and 180 acres of their own rented ground. Their first truck was older than either of them and fully paid for. Their first rule copied Earl exactly. If cash did not cover it, they waited. Earl never formed a public foundation, never renamed a building, never sought office. She formalized one thing in 2014, a private letter attached to her estate documents requiring that any heir receiving land must demonstrate 3 years of positive cash flow management without long-term machinery debt. Conditional inheritance was not punishment, it was continuity. The farm was not a trophy, it was an operating system. If you want more stories where arithmetic beats appearances, subscribe now and stay for the next ledger. If this one made you reconsider what growth should look like, leave a comment with the hardest financial choice you have seen a farm family face during low prices. Share this with one person who is mistaking borrowed scale for security, because that conversation can change a decade. By harvest light in late October, Earl parked the old Ford beside a machine shed lined with equipment that had outlived predictions and outperformed trends. No chrome, no showroom gloss, just maintained steel, paid for ground, and records that balanced. The woman many had read as poor because of rust, patches, and restraint had done the one thing hard agriculture always rewards in the end. She kept the right to choose. When corn hit $2, that right kept her land. Then it kept other families on theirs. The sun had dropped behind the west shelter belt when Earl shut the machine shed door and laid 5 folders across the hood of the 1989 Ford, each tabbed in her block handwriting. Tellez, Cruz, Nolan Whitaker, Pete Whitaker, Mentors. Dust hung in the yellow light, and the smell was diesel, dry corn leaves, and old steel that had been maintained instead of replaced. Maria arrived first in a feed truck, then Daniel in a 2-tone pickup with a repaired tailgate, then Nolan and Pete in separate rigs they had both bought used and paid off. Earl did not give a speech. She handed out updated statements. Maria's showed principal advanced $250,000, principal repaid $250,000 as of September 2012, interest charge $0, penalty $0, mentorship condition complete and extended voluntarily. Beneath that, in Earl's pen, 1 extra line. Scholarships funded independently. Verified $75,000 paid 2008 through 2012. Daniel's sheet read the same where it mattered. $180,000 advanced. $180,000 repaid by schedule acceleration. $0 interest. Condition complete. 4 operators mentored. Nolan's. $70,000 advanced. $70,000 repaid by 2009. Pete's. $70,000 advanced. $70,000 repaid by 2010. Each page included 1 column titled Avoided Interest Equivalent. Earl had calculated it at a conservative 7.25% annual borrowing alternative. Maria's avoided interest over 5 years, $49,346. Daniel's, $35,529. Nolan and Pete combined, $27,633. Total interest burden avoided, $112,508. Daniel looked down and let out one breath. That is the whole decade. Earl nodded once. That is why terms matter. By the first week of December 2012, they met again at the Hastings Extension Hall with Caleb Dunn and Iris Molina, now in their own business jackets with dust still on the cuffs. Maria brought scholarship paperwork. Daniel brought machinery logs. Nolan brought lease templates with 1-year resets. Pete brought cost per acre sheets color-coded by risk. Earl brought the original 1-page worksheet, What Can Be Dropped Fast, now copied so many times the county office had laminated it. Caleb stood at the whiteboard and wrote numbers that would have sounded unlikely 10 years earlier. His and Iris's custom operation grossed $214,800 that year, netted $62,300 after fuel, repairs, insurance, and wages, and carried no long-term note. Their oldest truck had 347,000 miles and a rebuilt transmission paid in cash. Iris added that they kept 3 envelopes exactly the way Earl had taught through the others: operating buffer, equipment replacement, opportunity fund. No borrowing for anything that did not survive a low-price scenario. The cascade became measurable in that room. 1 zero-interest pool of $900,000, revolving and partially redeployed, had supported 4 direct recoveries and 6 second-generation starts by 2016. Combined acres influenced through direct notes and document mentorship reached 3,480. Conservative equity across those operations, using county land values and depreciated machinery values, passed $18,400,000 by 2018. Local payroll and contractor spending tied to those operations crossed $5,100,000. No one clapped when the numbers were read. Farmers rarely do. They wrote the figures down. Trent Halverson's final resolution came in person, not in rumor. At his retirement dinner in June 2018, he stood in front of 140 growers at the Hastings VFW Hall, set his prepared notes aside, and called Earl by name. He said he had spent years selling packages that looked manageable in good seasons and became unforgiving in bad ones. He said he had watched one woman in patched clothes decline his best pitch and then outperform every growth plan he had promoted during the downturn. He read one line from the revised pamphlet she had corrected in 2012. 7-year total payout, financed at 8.4%, $292,320, cash purchase in distress cycle, comparable utility at $89,000, plus repairs. Difference, $203,320. He looked up and said, "That difference is survival." After retirement, he did the unglamorous work. Twice a month in Grand Island, he volunteered at a farm transition clinic with no sales desk and no commission sheets. Families brought lender offers, and Trent ran downside scenarios at $2 corn, 130 bushels, and rising input costs. If the plan failed there, he said so plainly. He died in 2023 after a short illness, and at his service, Daniel sat with his old dealership co-workers while Maria hugged Trent's widow near the back pew. The irony of his career never disappeared, but neither did his correction. He left with that part repaired. By late harvest 2019, Earl had started labeling boxes in the farmhouse office because paper had become history, and history had become useful. Box 1, original handwritten ledgers from 1967 forward, each year indexed by acreage, yield, and cash position. Box 2, certified check stubs from the 2000, 2002, 2009, and 2011 land purchases. Box 3, recovery pool notes with each release, signed, paid in full. Box 4, scholarship receipts Maria insisted she keep copies of. She donated copies to the County Historical Society in 2021 under one condition. Students could access them free. The Extension Office scanned every page. The files are now used in beginning farmer classes as case studies in low-price planning. The odd details that once triggered judgment also found their place. The grain shovel that had been wired to the old Chevrolet bed was cleaned, dated, and hung on a nail in the machine shed with a tag that read, "Tailgate latch failed." Cash discipline did not. The patched coat, with resewn cuffs, stayed on the same hook by the door. The 1971 Chevrolet, no longer road safe, was parked at the edge of the north shed and started once each summer until the engine finally seized in 2022. Earl kept it anyway. By the second week of October 2024, the county roll call could be read without missing anyone. Earl, 77, still lived in the modest farmhouse with the drafty window she had repaired twice, and finally replaced only when repair failed a third time. She still drove the worn 1989 Ford to town. Her land remained debt-free, operated through a conservative lease and custom mix that protected soil and cash flow. Maria still ran 410 acres, still funded two $7,500 scholarships annually, and by then had paid out $200,000 to $55,000 total. Daniel still farmed 520 acres, still debt-light, still mentoring. Nolan and Pete still ran separate operations, both solvent, both debt-free, both with written succession plans requiring cash reserves before expansion. Walter Hines' daughter, 82 and sharp, leased family ground to a beginning couple under harvest-based terms and called Earl every March to compare input bids. Caleb and Iris had grown to 260 acres plus custom work and had trained two younger drivers with the same no-note rule for machinery. Earl completed her own succession without spectacle. In January 2025, she signed final transfer documents, creating a conditional trust. Land beneficiaries had to show 3 consecutive years of positive operating cash flow, no long-term machinery debt, and documented mentorship of at least one beginning producer. Failure did not trigger sale. It triggered management by an independent local trustee until conditions were met. The farm would remain an operating system, not a liquidation event. If you want more stories where arithmetic cuts through appearances, subscribe and stay with this channel. If this story challenged your view of what growth means, comment with one number you now believe every farm family should calculate before signing a note. Share this with one producer who is being pushed toward borrowed scale they cannot survive. On a cold morning in November 2025, Earl walked to the machine shed before sunup, switched on the overhead strip light, and ran her hand across the fender of the rebuilt 1968 John Deere 4020 she bought for $9,400 cash, nearly half a century earlier. Paint worn thin. Engine sound steady. Paid for. Behind it hung the old shovel from the Chevrolet, and beside it sat boxes of ledgers that had outlasted every sales cycle, every whisper, every assumption made from rust and patches. The county had learned what she had known since she was a girl with a cigar box and 4 envelopes. Wealth is not what shines in good years. Wealth is what keeps choices alive in bad ones, then turns those choices outward so other families can stay on their land.